Verse 23 in chapter 14 of Isaiah. And in this section, that as far as the way in which I describe it, in verses 21 through verse 23, he is showing the extent of Babylon's destruction. And in that, it would be a complete or a total destruction, so that no one would be left and the city would become desolate. And that's what we see in verse 23 when he says, I will also make it a possession for the bittern and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the bosom of destruction, saith the Lord of hosts. This word bittern, or bittern, it's translated various ways. The New King James and the American Standard translates it as porcupine. The New American Standard, along with the ESV, the English Standard Version, translates it as water bird or hedgehog.
What's the definition I found? Like a hare, big tall bird.
A big tall bird. Swamp bird. Some have said it's defined as an owl. An owl, yes. So you can tell from the variations of just the way it's translated, the way it's defined, they're really not positive as to the exact meaning of what this is, bittern. Well, that would probably be true because of the pools of water. So it would correspond with that. But still, even though that might seem to be better suited for the context, still nobody knows what it is. And should that concern us? No, not really. Could whatever this is have gone out of existence? Do we have species or things go out of existence now? Well, why wouldn't we think that it might be something that we don't even know about then today? Don't know. And then it could be something that we just know of, and the identity by the name has been changed. So, but it would be a place where they would reside. It would also be a place for pools of water. This would be a swampy type nature that is stagnant. That's it. The main thing is man's not going to inhabit this place. And it's going to be swept with the broom of destruction. That shows the completeness of it. It's just going to be totally taken out of and destroyed. And as Paul said, there's not going to be anyone living there anymore. And that actually is the case. Now then, verses 24 through verse 27 And Andrew, I lost connection on that, so you might have to do this. We go into a section now dealing with the fall of Assyria. And in verse 24, he tells us that the Lord of hosts has sworn, saying, "Surely I have thought, so shall it come to pass. And as I have purposed, so shall it stand." God, in this, is going to bring about what he has planned. That is his destruction of Assyria in this case. And basically, he is confirming this with an oath. Lord swears. Now then, I would get into a discussion of, is it right for us to swear? But that's another subject that you can study on your own. So, but here, obviously, the Lord of hosts hath sworn. So he swore, he took an oath. And he had planned or purposed to destroy the Assyrians. And we see it's Assyrians, verse 25. And what he had planned, he will carry it out. He will bring it to pass. It's going to take place. It's going to stand. The scriptures often speak of the certainty of God's purpose. In 1 Kings 8 and verse 56, it says, "Blessed be the Lord that hath given rest unto his people Israel. According to all that he promised, there hath not failed one word of all his good promise, which he promised by the hand of Moses his servant." Not failed one promise. Not one word of his promise. There's certainty or surety of what God promises. Someone read Joshua chapter 1, verses 43 through verse 45. And we're going to see much the same thing. Joshua 21, verses 43 through 45. Now this is, of course, Joshua speaking to the children of Israel. So,
"And the Lord gave unto Israel all the land which he sware to give unto their fathers, and they possessed it, and dwelt therein. And the Lord gave them rest round about, according to all that he sware unto their fathers. And there stood not a man of all their enemies before them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. There fell not aught of any good thing which the Lord had spoken unto the house of Israel. All came to pass."
Does it sound like Joshua kind of emphasizes the same thing several times? God has fulfilled everything that he said. Not 10 lost tribes of the premillennial viewpoint. Also, the premillennialists hold that God did not give Israel all of the land. And so when Christ comes this second time to establish his kingdom, then all of the land will be Israel. Kind of contradictory in relationship to what Joshua says here. And I think we ought to be able to trust what Joshua says, since he was there at the scene at the time, and that he was writing by inspiration of God. So I think we ought to be able to trust what he says over what they say today. Being a little facetious there. but to get the point across. But God fulfilled everything that he said. Someone remember what 2 Peter 3 and verse 9 tells us?
The Lord is not slack concerning his promise, as some men count slackness, but is long-suffering us, we're not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance.
Okay. Just before this passage that's sometimes misused, 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is 1,000 years. And then you have this, the Lord's not slack concerning his promise. The 1,000 years is a day is 1,000 years, is in relationship to the promises of God. That it doesn't matter if it takes one day or if it takes 1,000 years, it doesn't matter. God will do what he says. God will be faithful to his promise. Even though man many times is not, yet God will be. We can always depend on God as to what he says. Just as kind of an aside, it irks me when I hear members of the Lord's church talking about on the day of judgment, maybe somehow God will find a way to save these people. Generally, it's those who have never heard the gospel, those in deepest, darkest Africa who has never heard the gospel, that God will certainly find a way to save them. Well, if he does, then he's a liar. Because if you read 2 Thessalonians 1, 6 through 9, it states very simply that God is going, or Christ will come in flaming fire to take vengeance upon them who, what? Know not God. Does that, using their example, person in deep, dark Africa who's never heard the gospel and thus they don't know God, what does the Bible, what does God say about that person? He's lost. God's going to take punishment upon him. So for us to come along and start saying, well, God surely will know his heart and somehow find a way to save him, that if he had heard the gospel, he would have obeyed. Well, he's lost. And by the way, that just kind of carries over into another idea in reality. The problem with that thinking is that a person is lost because he rejects the gospel. That's false.
They come up with the idea of what if a man is on his way to obey the gospel, headed down to the river to be baptized, and he gets in a car wreck.
Yeah. All of these scenarios that they come up with, made up scenarios, what if he was on his way to a meeting in which he was going to hear the gospel and he would believe, but he's killed in that same car wreck before he hears it and thus believes? Well, if you want to play the what-if scenarios, we can make them up all day long, and it doesn't amount to hill beans, is what God's Word says. It is the Christian's responsibility to reach that man in deep, dark Africa that's never heard the gospel. And I think that's really kind of a poor excuse nowadays anyway, with the way in which we have communication abilities. But the problem is when we find Christians, and I've even heard supposedly conservative preachers advocate such. And I say it irks me because it is a rejection of God's promises. If God can say that, and let me go back to what I said in relationship to a person is not lost because he rejects the gospel. He's lost because he commits sin. The gospel is God's power to save him. If he rejects that gospel, he has rejected that which would save him. He's not lost because he rejects it. He was already lost. Use the illustration. Here's a person drowning out in the lake, or whatever we want to say in relationship to that. And we throw him a lifeline, or that ring that's to save them, whatever it's called. Life preserver. And, well, we can get to that. Let me finish the illustration first. If that person in that water rejects that life preserver, is he lost? Does he drown because he rejected the life preserver? No, because he was in the water. That's why he drowns. A person commits sin, that makes him lost. If he rejects the gospel, he has rejected that which is able to save him. But he's lost either way. He's not lost because he rejects the gospel. The gospel is God's power to save, not God's power to condemn. Now, I know that's it's an aspect really that we need to keep in our mind. We know it, but we don't always apply it properly. Now, here we're talking about Romans 1:18 and following, the wrath of God coming upon those who disobey. That's true. They disobey, and because of that, the wrath of God comes upon them. And verse 16, a couple of verses earlier, that's God's power to save them from that is the gospel. So understand the difference. But God is going to be faithful to what he says. And that's one of the great lessons that we learn throughout the Old Testament. God's faithful, and he can be trusted because he's going to do what he says. If you want to go into even delve into that more in a study, consider also those nations, for example, that God spares. Why did God spare Nineveh when Jonah went to him? Jonah's message was what? Yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be destroyed. Why weren't they destroyed then? Well, because they repented. They changed their state in relationship to God, and because they changed their state in relationship to God, God spared them. We are lost in sin. We change our state. What happens to us? We become saved by our obedience to the gospel. Same principle. God's faithful in both situations, even though his relationship to that nation or that relationship to that individual changes because that nation or individual changes himself. But again, we go back to what he is stating here. God purposed it. God's going to be faithful to that which he purposes, that which he planned. In this case, verse 25, and I will break the Assyrian in my land and upon my mountain, tread him underfoot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. God's purpose that we read about in verse 24 is to break Assyria in his land and tread him underfoot. No doubt the fulfillment of this is seen in the death of the 185,000 soldiers one night, where the rest of them woke up and all of those 185,000 of their fellow soldiers were dead. Sennacherib's army, in this case, was basically destroyed. And it was on the mountains near Jerusalem. The yoke, then shall his yoke depart from off them. This is the burden that actually was imposed by Tiglath-Pileser. Turn over to 2 Kings chapter 16. And in verses 7 through verse 10 of 2 Kings 16, so Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria, and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria hearkened unto him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus, and took it, and carried the people of it captive to Kir, and slew Rezin. And King Assyria went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw an altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Urijah the priest the fashion of the altar and the pattern of it, according to all the workmanship thereof. So here, and to tie this in with something that we've already studied, go back to chapter 7. And there, in chapter 7, where in verse 14, you have the prophecy of the virgin birth of Christ. What's it, the background of it? This that we're talking about here. That here's Ahaz. He is afraid of these two nations, Syria, the king of Syria, and the king of Israel, Rezin and Pekah. And God says you don't need to worry about them. In a few years, they're going to be destroyed. And as confirmation, ask for any miracle that you desire. And he says, no, I won't do that. And God says, well, I'll give a sign unto the house of Israel, a child or a woman shall be with child. And it's the virgin birth of Christ. But he also sets forth a time frame. Well, instead of, and probably Ahaz had this in mind when God offers him that assurance that he's going to send people to Tiglath-Pileser to get help, and that Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, would save him from these two nations. When he does that, what happens? He becomes subject to Tiglath-Pileser, and now then there's this yoke, burden or tax that is placed upon them, in which basically Ahaz has sent all of the gold and silver to the king of Assyria. Well, now then, God's going to break that yoke that had been imposed upon them. It's going to be lifted so that it's no longer there. This that brought about Sennacherib's invasion, or that which provokes the invasion of Sennacherib, would be found in 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 13 through verse 16. That in the 14th year of King of King Hezekiah did Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, come up against all the fenced cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria, to Lachish, saying, I have offended. Return from me. That which thou puttest on me will I bear. What's he saying? I rebelled against you. And now then, you're invading us, and you're more powerful than us, so you go back home, and I'll be subject to you again. Now, that's what's happening with Hezekiah in relationship to Sennacherib now. And it says, and the king of Assyria appointed unto Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. And Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house. At that time did Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the pillars which Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. So he had refused to pay the taxes. Sennacherib invades him, or invades the land, and Hezekiah is there saying, I'll start paying the taxes again. Go home. But God has another plan, another purpose, in which he's going to destroy Sennacherib's army. When Sennacherib comes against Jerusalem, 185,000 soldiers then die. So that's the background of this. If you remember that those kings of different nations and time frame that I get handed out at the very beginning of the king study of the prophets, the reason you deal with all of these other nations and kings and to be at least familiar with them is because the Bible ties in with all of that. If you don't understand, okay, here's Sennacherib and his time frame being the time frame of Hezekiah, and you can't understand these things. So that was the reason that tried to give you that, or I gave you that at the very beginning. Hopefully you still have that. Probably not. Some of you do. I see you grabbing it. So there's even a couple left up here on the front pew even, if you've lost one and want another copy. Verse 26 then. This is the purpose that is purposed upon the whole earth, and this is the hand that stretched out upon all the nations. God's purpose in punishing Assyria, or you could say then later on Babylon, affected the whole world, all the known nations, and thus, as he puts it here, the whole earth. All the nations. Each nation, while in power, stretched out their hand upon the other nations of the world. Someone turn over and read Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 23. Jeremiah 50 and verse 23. All right. The whole earth, and then he says Babylon. Now, why the distinction? Well, really, it's not all that difficult to understand, because in the destruction of Babylon, all of the nations were affected, because Babylon was the world empire. Now then, when we come back to this in verse 26, this is the hand that is stretched out upon all the nations. Yet he's talking about the destruction of Assyria. I think the pulpit commentary puts this in good perspective for us when it writes, "No sooner did one subject nation recover her freedom than an electric shock ran through all the rest. Plots were laid, confederacies formed, revolts planned, embassies sent hither and thither. The complete destruction of Assyria involved a complete change in the relations not only of the principal powers, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Media, Elam, but even the minor ones, Philistia, Edom, Moab, Syria, Phoenicia, Ammon." So, if one nation rebelled and was successful against the ruling nation, then all of these others wanted to get free also. They didn't want to be subject to Assyria in this case. And so they would start making their plans to get free. And thus they would form these confederacies to fight against Assyria, and you would find basically the entire world being affected. Well, when God destroyed the Assyrian army this way, what happens to Assyria and its capital city? Well, they are basically lose all of their power and all of their influence. All of these nations that were paying tribute to them, they're going to stop. Why should I continue to pay tribute? You can't enforce it now. Sometimes people in our society would say, why should we pay taxes if the government can't enforce anything? But guess what? We know that the IRS is one of the most powerful institutions in the world, and it can come and take everything that you have without even taking it to court, getting an injunction or anything else. They can take all of your paycheck. And so what do? Because of that enforcement arm of the IRS, we pay our taxes. It's not very difficult to understand, is it, when we put it down on our level? If there was no enforcement, then why would we pay taxes? That's the nations in relationship to Assyria. There's no enforcement now because God has destroyed Assyria and their army, and so why should we pay tribute or taxes? They're not. And so verse 27, "For the Lord of hosts hath purposed, and who shall disannul it? And his hand is stretched out, and who shall turn it back?" So again, basically, we're going back to what Isaiah has already written on this about God's plans, God's purposes, and now then he says no one can disannul it, or no one can annul those plans. While this is put in the form of a question, and who can disannul it, who shall turn it back, it's a rhetorical question that no one can stop or disannul God's will. Now then, a lot of people might try to, but they cannot succeed. They cannot turn it back. It's an impossibility. Carl? Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, that's your fault, ain't it? Didn't God tell you to go into the whole world and preach the gospel?
You're going back to what we left a long time ago, but yes, that is the case. It is our responsibility in that case to take the gospel.
And Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15:34, "Awake to be
to your shame, because people don't have a knowledge of God, and they should have. You should maintain the gospel to them. Okay, verses 28 through verse 32 then. This last section of chapter 14 is the fall of Philistia. And basically Philistia is going to be crushed under Assyria. But we're also going to learn a great lesson that God protects his people. Verse 28, in the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. So this came in the year that King Ahaz died. Now that year is disputed, but it's generally given at either 726 or 725 BC. The previous prophecies, starting in chapter 10 and going through chapter 14 and verse 27, were given during the reign of Hezekiah. This one now is the year that King Ahaz died. Now, in kind of preparing for this, the pulpit commentary explains it this way. The Philistines had suffered grievously at the hands of Judah in the reign of Uzziah, 2 Chronicles 26:6, and had retaliated in the reign of Ahaz, 2 Chronicles 28:18. It would seem that after this they were invaded by Tiglath-Pileser, who penetrated as far as Gaza, which he took and made tributary, as he also did Ascalon. Tiglath-Pileser died shortly before Ahaz, and the present burden seems to have been uttered in connection with his death. Isaiah warns Philistia, which is equivalent to Palestinia, that her rejoicing is premature. Tiglath-Pileser will have successors as powerful and as cruel as himself, and these successors will carry destruction and ravage over the whole land. So that's kind of as a prelude to what's going to take place in these verses. In verse 29, he tells him, "Rejoice not thou, whole Palestinia, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. For out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent." Isaiah's message here is for the whole of Palestine, which was made up of a number of principalities, or we might say a number of small states or countries even, might liken it unto that. Tiglath-Pileser has died. They're not to rejoice, though, for something worse, a worse force will come upon them than what Tiglath-Pileser was. They were rejoicing here at the rod that smote them, as he puts it here, is broken. Probably the death of Tiglath-Pileser. By the way, I'll mention that some think that it's the yoke imposed by Uzziah in 2 Chronicles 26:6 that was thrown off under Ahaz in 2 Chronicles 28:18. But in all probability, it refers to Tiglath-Pileser. The rod that he had upon them is now broken. But there's going to come one more dangerous than Tiglath-Pileser. More powerful rulers, Assyrian rulers. And that would be Sargon and Sennacherib, who would come and destroy them. Pulpit commentary again states that Sennacherib is perhaps this fruit. He conquered Ascalon and Ekron, and had the kings of Gaza and Ashdod among his tributaries. Whether it's Sargon, Sennacherib, probably both of them would certainly apply. That this one rod is broken, but there's going to come worse upon you. And he uses there the serpent's root shall come forth cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. So something worse than what Tiglath-Pileser was. In verse 30, and the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety, and I will kill thy root with famine, and he shall slay thy remnant. Andrew, if you would move that on down a little ways to verse 30. The firstborn of the poor would represent or stand for the poorest of the poor. So you have, as we might put it, you have the poor, and then you have the dirt poor. They're the poorest of the poor. That's what he's dealing with here. The firstborn of the poor shall feed. In other words, God's going to take care of them. Probably here he's referring to the Jews, the Israelites. And they are able to feed, and they're able to lay down in safety. Now then, what a wonderful promise that God makes to them. This would be while Philistia was held in subjection. God kills with famine, a man with sword. So you've got the famine, the sword, resting behind their strong walls till the hunger did its work, thinning the ranks of the Assyrian conqueror, who would storm their city and slaughter their remnant. But God's going to take care of those poor, probably the Israelites. So we'll start with verse 31 and get into chapter 15, Lord willing, next week.